Okay, for those of you who haven't noticed or haven't been to Ballroom B this year, we are actually streaming the sessions that come out of this room to all parts of the world for those colleagues of ours who weren't able to make it to this year's La Cosecha. And I know some of you were here a little bit earlier for Dr. Jose Medina's session, and the place was packed. And so I'm not going to let him get away with being the one that has the most people in the room. There is plenty of room up front here so you could be in our shot, and the seats up here are just as cheap as they are in the back. So if you would please move up, we really would prefer that. It'd make it for a little more intimate setting. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. My name is David Rogers, and just to make sure you're in the right place, our presentation this afternoon is Socio-Cultural Competence in the Dual Language Classroom, and I have the honor of just sort of kicking us off. Are we going to just introduce ourselves? Is that okay? Because I will not do a good job. I mean, I will say that I know you, if that's okay. Okay. I really am proud to be here as part of this group to at least kick off this afternoon's session with Dr. Beatriz Arias and Lisa Tabacu from the Center of Applied Linguistics. These are colleagues of ours who have worked tirelessly to help develop, are engaged in the research that we all so very much need, as well as in the development of resources and actually providing on-site development, technical assistance and program and professional development to many of our schools in this country. I'm particularly excited by this. We were all excited actually at Dual Language Education when this session came through through the online proposals portal that we have when we're collecting proposals for the presentations each year. Because sociocultural competency is so darn important, and the real promise of our well-implemented dual language education programs. I'm sure many of you remember that where the 3 goals of dual language education is academic success in 2 or more languages, bilingual biliteracy, the 3rd goal has always been sociocultural competency is what we want to develop in our students. For my own daughters, my older daughters I have 4 daughters, bendito entre las mujeres. My 2 older daughters are Anglo, and then I was a single dad for quite a while, and then married La Rossi, who have you seen around here, and so my 2 younger daughters are Mexican American. First language for my older daughters was English. My first language for my younger daughters is Spanish in the home. And why am I sharing this with you? Why am I sharing this with us? The sociocultural. So for so long, programs were having a hard time. Everyone was jumping on board to do dual language because of the promise of academic success for our second language learners, but also that extra. We're also going to be putting out bilingual and bicultural students from our programs that will be graduating, going into the world, and hopefully contributing, competing in the world. But we were referring to the 3rd goal as the forgotten goal, because when new programs were popping up, they were very much focused on making sure that we had proper language allocation for providing instruction. We were making sure we were doing enough instruction in the non-English language. And we were also making sure that we were developing and choosing curriculum that was going to allow us to have a rigorous curriculum. Those 2 pieces were in place 20, 25 years ago when dual language education became popular again. As we know, or at least I remember, in the Brown movement, when we talked about bilingual education, we somos muchos. I was about, I don't know, 9 or 10 when the Brown movement happened. But the deal is that I remember specifically that our brown brothers and sisters were asking for bilingual, bicultural education in our schools. And what they were talking about was dual language education. Somehow through the 70s and the 80s, we kind of lost that focus, and it went more to, okay, we'll use Spanish as an instructional language, but only until they have sufficient English to be successful in school. Boy, that was a bag of garbage that was sold to us. And fortunately, people like Dr. David Ramirez and others in the late 80s started saying, wait a second. What we're finding is we can get with language support, with home language support with our kiddos, we can get to an academic English proficiency in 3, 4, or 5 years. However, if we continue using that home language, we see much higher academic performance and achievement happening in our schools. And so we've got to get back to what was once dual language, and that's why we're here. But again, sociocultural competency, unfortunately, as the third goal, was being left to the side, at least in the early 90s and the mid 90s, by many, many schools that were taking on dual language education. And I am so happy to say, fast forward to 2019 into the Cosecha conference, sociocultural competence and critical consciousness is on the tips of all of our tongues here as we look at what's right for our students, at least in our inner community. And now the conversation is rich, it's happening, it's a little bit charged sometimes, we're a little passionate about this, but now it's about us getting this right in our schools and for our school communities. With the Center of Applied Linguistics as a lead on the guiding principles for dual language education, they were the ones that said this document has to be created in 2001. It finally was published somewhere in 2003, 2004. We have our third edition, or our second revision, third edition, that's out now. And you will find the need for us to be socioculturally responsive everywhere in that guiding document. However, the conversation continues and how we can be more specific in our development of that component of our programs. It no longer is just an add-on, it's no longer the goal that sometimes gets forgotten, it's actually within the frame of everything we do now in our schools. And I'm very, very happy that we have this presentation this afternoon. And so without further ado, I'm gonna hand this over to Dr. Beatrice Arias.
Thank you very much, David. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I know it's a Friday afternoon, but we're talking about this document. Have you seen this? Raise hands. All right, all right. And if you haven't, you can download it for free from our website. If you'd like a hard copy, you can buy one. But we're very proud of this, and David and Lisa and many other people worked to infuse this new edition of Guiding Principles, third edition, we call it GP3, with sociocultural components. And so that's what we're here to share with you today. My colleague Lisa Tabaku and I will be walking you through some of the components of the guiding principles, and I, since I've been a professor of bilingual education for eons, it seems, I'm going to just kind of take you through the development of sociocultural competence, because it's been 30 years in development. And as David said, we're in a whole new place. We're even thinking about a fourth pillar. And so this is the kind of discussion we need to have with you, and we hope by the end of our talk, we will be sharing around the tables what you think of the fourth pillar possibility. Okay, so without further ado, I'll start here and say that we're going to do a deep dive into sociocultural competence. And when dual language education was first being conceptualized about 30 years ago, probably before many of you were born, there was a very different approach to what sociocultural competence meant. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of the evolution so that you can see where we are now and why some people might think that they're still kind of stuck in attitudes or identity, and where we want to go with the idea of critical consciousness. So today I'm going to give you a little overview of sociocultural competence and then show you how it is distributed across the document of Guiding Principles 3. And at that point, we'll have a table activity where you might see that we didn't have enough handouts for everybody, but at your table you can work on sharing with all of us examples of what you do in your classrooms and in your schools to reinforce sociocultural competence in the curriculum and instruction and in family community. Then Lisa will take us through some activities on sociocultural competence in the classroom and envisioning a fourth pillar, and then we hope to have table discussions about what that fourth pillar will look like. So right now, just a kind of warm-up activity, perhaps you could turn to your shoulder partner and say, what do you think is socio-cultural competence? Take a little break right now and get to know your neighbor and say, well, what does socio-cultural competence mean to you? Okay, so get some, yeah, so get some ideas now. Yeah, okay. One more minute. So who would like to share with us what you think sociocultural competence means in the dual language classroom? Is that a hand I see back there? No? Don't be shy. We all estamos en familia aquí en la Cosecha.
Well, we talked about celebrating differences, recognizing differences, but celebrating them and really getting to know our students, to know their backgrounds, where they're coming from, and what they bring to the classroom.
Yes, getting to know your students is probably a fundamental part of becoming a very good teacher. Where do they come from? What are they, and I don't mean, it could be where they come from geographically, but what their expectation is of school, how knowledgeable they are about schooling, what their families do. It's very important to get to know our students and celebrating their strengths and their not seeing differences as a deficiency. Somebody else? Yes, back there, Lisa.
In our conversation, we were talking about in my perspective, the view of social-cultural competence from the point of view of a teacher. So our ability to navigate the diverse identities, backgrounds, and abilities that we have in our classroom, and how do our students see themselves reflected in our practice and in our curriculum. and just in the way that we navigate about the classroom, and then in us understanding their backgrounds, as the first person said, and how do we help them really identify their skills and build upon those and build upon their weaknesses so that they can be successful in whatever it is they choose to do.
Really good points. So how do our kids see themselves reflected in the curriculum? Do we use materials that, you know, are in their language or reflect their experiences? I think that's a very important thing that we need to think about, what is in your classroom libraries. Other ideas?
Sorry about that interruption, and also sorry about the volume of my voice. But I think of socio-cultural competence more about the how and the why than about the what we know about another culture. But it's why it's important to be open. The competency of just wanting to be open to another culture, and how we engage with another culture. Because, you know, you never can really definitely know another culture unless you're in that culture, but it's just your openness to allow that culture to influence you, to change you, and also to be very interested and very willing to engage that culture in a broader sphere.
Good points. And so we see that why sociocultural understanding is because it becomes part of our identity, right? Who we are. I am my language. I am my culture. And so to the extent that that permeates your identity, it is important to recognize it and validate it. So all of those components are currently reflected in our guiding principles. But before we dive into that, I'd like to share with you a little bit about how sociocultural came to be defined over time. We know that there are 3 pillars of, currently, there might be 3.5 or 4, of dual language education. And from the beginning, academic achievement, bilingualism and biliteracy, and sociocultural competence were seen as those 3 pillars. The first, bilingualism and biliteracy, students will be able to speak and understand each of the 2 program languages, if not more. Students can also read, write, and use each of the 2 program languages to support the continued growth of the other. So initial research on dual language education focused on this particular pillar and said, well, we're going to assess the student's proficiency in the partner language. So there was a lot of effort to assess proficiency and bilingualism in the second language, in the partner language, if you will. And then also in academic achievement. The point was, people were worried. If we teach kids 2 languages, are they going to fall behind? And the point was to show that students in dual language programs are able to achieve grade level competence in core areas, and that we also will assure that specials and special education and gifted and talented services are also offered in dual language. So both of these goals, academic achievement and bilingualism and biliteracy, are easily measured, if you will. We have, by force of law and tradition, standardized tests that we have to use. Not everybody assesses in the native language or in the partner language, and that's something that we have to work on, and the whole area of assessment is working on. And on bilingualism and biliteracy, we have measures. But when we get to the third goal, when we get to sociocultural competence, that becomes a little bit more wishy-washy in terms of how do we assess it? How do we know it's happening in the classroom? What guidance can we provide for teachers in terms of how to incorporate sociocultural activities? Or what is it? So we have multicultural curriculum, We have instruction that promotes sociocultural competence, and we hope that everyone is working to understanding and advocating for culturally linguistic diversity. Okay. Uno más. But what we find when we get to the area of sociocultural diversity is that there's a lot of different definitions, and that starts to confuse us. In the beginning, Donna Christian, in talking about bilingual programs, talked about the ability to demonstrate positive cross-cultural attitudes and behaviors, and high levels of self-esteem. So that's two things, right? Attitudes, positive attitudes, and self-esteem. I like myself because I'm bilingual or biliterate. And so at the same time, different terms were being used: cultural appreciation, sociocultural competence, cross-cultural understanding. You know, we've got all these terms there in trying to identify this third goal. And it does cause some, confusion. What are we working on? The more specific we can be, we can help teachers focus on what things we can do in curriculum, what can we do in instruction, what can we do in family and community, because cross-cultural competence is throughout all of those components. So if we conceptualize cross-cultural competence as attitudes, what do you think of? And skills between students and from different linguistic backgrounds. If we think about the ability to demonstrate positive cross-cultural attitudes, it boils down to how you feel about yourself as well as others. And so attitudes were a very important part of the beginning of the evolution of cross-cultural competence. And I'll tell you that I think I would share with you and suggest that over 30 years, the term has evolved, okay? And we started with attitudes. How do you feel about kids who speak a language other than yours? Or learning a language makes me feel good about myself. And so in this little timeline, over 30 years, you can see that in 1987, the research was talking primarily about attitudes, cross-cultural attitudes. And then 10 years later, self-esteem starts to enter that. Like, you really need to think about yourself. You can't have attitudes towards others until you know how you feel about yourself. And then it evolved a little more about we want positive attitudes towards the other students in the classroom, not only the majority students, but the minority students also. And then the research evolved from there to say, well, you really can't have an attitude about somebody until you really understand your own identity. And so that's why I was saying, well, part of the reason for sociocultural competence and why we see it as a continuum is because we develop our sociocultural competence. We start, as young children, and we start learning about others so that perhaps by the time we're 10 or 11, we start to develop as bicultural, bilingual individuals. And then today, or a couple years ago, the idea started to continue to evolve the idea of sociocultural competence to say, is it enough to have a third pillar? Perhaps we need to have another pillar or that focuses on critical consciousness, where we think about the relationships of power between the groups of language speakers in our schools and classrooms. So we start with this idea of attitudes and skills, that we're demonstrating positive cross-cultural attitudes. And I don't mean to demean it, I just want to emphasize that it's become much more complex. It's not only an attitude, it's also a behavior, it's also a way of seeing the world. But initial research that was done by Kathy Lindholm Leary and by Donna Christian and by Thomas and Collier found that dual language immersion students had more favorable attitudes to kids who spoke other languages. And that would be a really good thing because, I grew up where people said, say something in Spanish, and then I'd say something and they'd laugh at me. And so I go, oh, well, I'm not gonna speak in Spanish if they're gonna laugh at me. So the evolution of the research was from 87 to 2001, focusing on attitudes, and it was primarily quantitative research, where it was, filling out questionnaires and how do you feel about this and that. So we had the findings that an appreciation of culture and of multiple cultures was represented in the program, that cross-cultural competence or attitudes called attention to linguistic and as well as cultural variation, that you could use the study of language in mutually reinforcing ways and promote integration of language and culture. So some of the studies that were done had asked these kinds of questions. I'm focusing on the attitude type of questions. And so the kids would respond. Learning another language would help me get along better with others. A refreshing thought that the students in the dual language program saw that their acquisition of another language was going to help them in their social interactions. Or, I want to become friends with someone who speaks a non-English language. Wow! I'm sorry, I come from Arizona, and so from when people want to say, oh, I want to be friends with somebody who speaks a non-English language, that's refreshing in an English-only state. So, but then we have to push it. We have to push it a little bit more. It's not just an attitude. When we talk about competence, it's like, what can you do with it in another way? And so, at this point, we're going a little bit beyond attitudes. Maybe it's 2001, maybe it's about 2005, and people are saying, well, you have to develop your own identity. Who am I? And as much as we try, my boys, I raised my boys to be bilingual, but I've watched as they've grown when they were monolingual Spanish speakers and then went to school and got exposed to English. And my son used to work in middle school as a teacher's helper, translating things for those kids who needed translation. And then one day, he came home and said, Mom, I don't want to do that anymore. And I go, ¿Qué pasó, mijo? What's the matter? He says, well, they called me a beaner. And so he all of a sudden experienced had a very negative experience because using his bilingualism wasn't getting him positive notices, right? He was getting called names. And so how do we help our children, understand that there are these power relationships, and that will speak to the fourth goal. But how do we strengthen them in their identity? And at that point, with him in middle school, it was like, it's okay, sweetie, you have another language. We will be able to use that language in other settings, and finding places where he could do that. So at this point, people say it's not just enough to be aware. We have to be self-aware. That it's seeing similarities and differences in each other, and seeing differences as an opportunity to connect rather than an obstacle. So, my son didn't have the skills at 12 to be able to see that was an opportunity to be able to get students to find him more interesting. So 2012, there's a strong sense of one's own cultural identity is a first important step in developing intercultural sensitivities and cross-cultural competence. So now we're getting very developmental. It's not just an attitude, but we have to help our students develop their own self-identity in order to them be able to become cross-culturally competent. Because if I'm secure and strong in my own self-identity, I'm not threatened by a different identity, right? I'm willing to listen to others. The research then that reinforced this idea of identity was not so much that large quantitative work, but was work more of small scale and qualitative studies. Coming up now towards the current time, we see that critical consciousness has been raised by scholars as another component of sociocultural competence, and that we aren't in a vacuum. We have to recognize, and we can have to help my son Jose recognize, well, yes, English is the language of power, but Spanish is the language of your family and of your culture, and that is equally important. But this idea of critical consciousness then pushes the pillar. Is this cross-cultural competence, or is it another? Is it another a pillar? But when we look at the idea of critical consciousness, it offers us a humanizing framework to look at how we are developing cultural competence. So critical consciousness in dual language education is a way to combat the myths through an understanding of power relationships in the formation. It allows students to engage in meaningful instructional projects that help them solve problems. And as Claudia Cervantes Son says, encouraging each student to locate his or her identity within a certain context of histories of power and imperialism. Now, as somebody who prepared bilingual teachers, we didn't do this in the classroom. We didn't prepare teachers in the 1990s and 2000s to become critical educators. I think we have to do that now. And so I think this speaks to teacher preparation and to what extent we emphasize critical consciousness in teacher preparation. And so that's the background. That is like the research basis for how we've gotten to today's version of sociocultural competence. It was building on attitudes. It incorporated identity. It started to add cultural competence and now sociocultural competence and critical consciousness. So you see an evolution of the whole concept over 30 years. And so what we tried to do in guiding principles was to actually take then each of the strands in the guiding principles and develop components that would emphasize sociocultural competence. If you're familiar with the dual language principles, you know that it's divided into these 7 strands. And so we tried to make sure that each strand had sociocultural components and keys. So we have the program goals. The program promotes sociocultural equity. The curriculum is culturally responsive. Instruction includes a variety of strategies. Assessment, including demographic information, guides program development. Staff are selected, and there's a positive and welcoming approach to family and community. So these are the strands within guiding principles and some of the things that we emphasize. So in curriculum, probably many of you do this, but you have authentic multicultural resources. And my goodness, we are so lucky, so blessed to be in this auditorium where all I see are these fantastic culturally relevant materials, authentic materials in multiple languages. So that's what we are looking for in the curriculum. And so the curriculum promotes multiculturalism and diversity. In instruction, what do you do to make sure that there's equitable participation? Maybe you use equity sticks, pair-share activities, homogeneous and heterogeneous learning, cooperative learning. These are all examples of what instructional practices are that promote sociocultural competence. Similarly, in assessment, that the home language data is part of how students are identified and students are assessed in English and the partner language. For several years, I worked with secondary teachers, and I'd ask them, well, how do you know if your students are English language learners? And they say, oh, I've got 160 kids in a day. How am I going to know if they're English language learners or not? And I go, well, don't you have a roster? Don't you have something that takes the data from the district when they assess the kids and puts it on your roster and shows you? And it was just amazing to me that we hadn't filled those little gaps so that a teacher could just have on their roster, these are your L's, these are not your L's, and whatever. And that hadn't happened. And so it was just, so how can a teacher start to begin to understand what needs to be done if they don't have comprehensive understanding of what the kids can do? Staff quality and professional development. We've been talking a little bit in other meetings about having a stance. How do we make sure that our teachers have a certain kind of stance, maybe a translanguaging stance? And I would always think about this in teacher preparation. We didn't screen our teachers very well. So, the student teachers who came, perhaps they had experience with other languages and cultures, and perhaps they hadn't. But if they hadn't, then they didn't have the sociocultural competence, right, to be able to work with the kids. And I think it's important to screen teachers, at least in our dual language programs, that we know that we've got teachers who feel the same way and appreciate the goals of dual language in order to implement the program. So professional development activities also need to develop the knowledge and the disposition skills that are needed to work with bilingual students. But professional development is after pre-service education. I hope you all have come from schools where you have a really positive attitude towards your community. Sometimes schools look like fortresses. You really don't, there's only one, because of this violent society we live in today, there's many walls, many barriers, many fences, and so you can only go in through one way, and so is there a sign that says, this is the way to enter the school? Is there a sign that says, this is the administration in multiple languages? Is there a friendly person at the front desk who says, oh, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad to see you. Welcome. My experience, unfortunately, is that doesn't happen all the time. And parents and family members feel alienated from being in the school simply because it's not friendly. It's not welcoming, and how can we make our schools a more welcoming community? How about sending home a bilingual report card? How about helping parents understand what does a report card measure and what do those numbers or letters mean? And then also, how can we help inform our parents, teach our parents about the school system in order for them to be voices in the system? So with those ideas and that background, I'm sure many of you have done many of these things, but if you could now turn to your table activities or your table partners, we've placed a little handout on your table that asks you to provide some samples of what you do in your school in curriculum, instruction, or family and community, and talk around the table about what you might do in your schools around those things, and we'll take a few minutes to have you fill that out, and then we will share, and Lisa will take us from there. You're not what? Okay. Oh, yeah. Will you take the mic around again? Okay, perfect. And then, when you finish, we want them to talk about critical consciousness. So that's another, yeah. No? Take another minute.
Okay. I can in a minute. She's actually coming back, but I don't know. But yeah, right.
Exactly. But you know what? We're going to have a few more
Okay.
other opportunities to talk about how.
Okay. I'm excited to hear what you have to share with us today. I know there must be some really wonderful ideas that we can build on from this wonderful group of educators. So I'll start with the curriculum, and Lisa's walking around with a mic. Would somebody like to share some of their evidence for what they do with regard to curriculum to promote sociocultural development?
Daring soul. Ah, good.
Hi, I'm from Illinois, and we are trying to really take a deeper look in our curriculum to see how culturally relevant it is, because we are finding more and more that our curriculum is designed for a general education population, and there's no cultural relevance. There's nothing to do with culture. So the more we go into, the more we I don't know if it happens in other districts, but maybe it's just a Illinois phenomena. But the more we look into, the deeper we go in, there is not a whole lot. So we have been doing this for a long, long, long time, and we have made very, very little movement into embedding, Common Core in Espanol curriculum, Spanish language arts, Arabic, whatever that is, that enriches the curriculum that we have for our general population. And if you think about instruction as a teacher, how can you teach if you don't have the tool? So it makes teaching very difficult. I'll shut up.
Any suggestions for what they can do there in Illinois for curriculum? What has somebody else done? Over there, Lisa.
Crystal?
Hi, I'm Crystal Lothrop. I'm from Washington State and Puyallup School District, and our district is very similar situation where we have a very good curriculum, but it's not extremely culturally relevant. So what we do is our curriculum is broken down into themes, and like for example, our Unit 1 is about rules and ways we participate in our communities. I love literacy, so I like to stay involved with Goodreads. I don't know if everybody knows about that, but I like to see any new winners that come out because usually they have very culturally relevant topics with new books. And so I will assign 2 or 3 books along with my partner teacher in order to supplement our curriculum to support the main topic, theme, and language and vocabulary through the extensions of good quality read-alouds in literature that are involving those themes. For example, in kindergarten, I still teach about immigration through read-alouds because it is important to our community. Our community is made up of 45%, I don't want to say illegal immigrants, but most are undocumented. And our kids understand that because they come saying, oh, señora, my mommy was scared last night because La Migra was in our neighborhood and they thought they were going to come to our trailer. And so thinking about those things, we try to find other ways to support it through journaling on top of the literacy, using current events. And just because they're younger doesn't mean they don't understand. You just have to frame it in a context in which they'll understand the cultural, social relevance, because they do, even though they're about that age. So supplementing your curriculum, because we know curriculum's expensive. It's a lot cheaper to build extension units using GLAD and those read-alouds and writing and just tie it all together so that you're still supporting those Common Core standards and the social cultural relevance.
3 great ideas. Thank you. Supplementing the curriculum with culturally relevant work, doing read-alouds, being able to do that kind of work with students and not avoiding those issues that our children are living with every day. That was one of the first things that got me into teaching when I was a teacher in Pasadena. La Migra came and took my kids' parents and aunts one day from the White House laundry, and I'm in my trailer and it's 3:30 in the afternoon, and in come 6 little kids and go, Miss, there's nobody home. There's nobody home, and this was over 30 years ago. I thought this was over with, but no, it's happening every day, and so we need to be able to help our children deal with these very traumatic situations. So supplementing the curriculum is important. And in Illinois, there's some wonderful school districts that are K-12 dual language programs. U46 has a lot of resources. Others in curriculum. What else suggestions do we have? Ooh, sorry.
We were talking about traditional events, things that are very culturally relevant in families. I think sometimes we worry so much about, that we're all so different, so let's not bring to the table everything that everybody else does in their homes, in their cultures. And I think that it's more about bringing it all to the table and introducing all the different traditions and cultures, bringing the families into it, and making sure that it's something that everybody can be a part of and everybody can understand, and, you know, celebrating each other and celebrating those festivities. And that's a way that everybody can come together and teach one another about that, not just in the classroom, but culturally inviting the whole community to be a part of that as well.
Good ideas, good ideas. There's one over here, Lisa.
Oh, my friend.
And as you said, not only Elgin has really good programs in Illinois, but so does CBS. So one of the ways that we, in addition to celebrating, is we focus on the arts. So we bring artists from Mexico. That, for example, we just had the parade in downtown Chicago. So we brought an artist from Guanajuato, third generation artist of alebrijes. So we had the students do alebrijes, and we use them in the parade in downtown. And our theme was La Familia. We also have an early childhood program. Our school serves around 1,500 students. We're right there by Midway Airport. And what we did is we focus on our dual language programs and trying to open it up to other students from other languages. So we have also Chinese, a lot of Arab, Polish, and our 80-20 model, we offer them the opportunities to learn in Spanish first. So we also use a lot of oracy, and some of the strategies are circles and squares. And also in our celebrations, we, like in early childhood, we wanted to celebrate El Grito, but we focus on other countries that also celebrate El Grito, which were, you know, so they don't only have to see, oh, it's not a Mexican thing. No, it's also other countries that celebrate their independence during that time. And the teachers also using curriculum, creative curriculum in preschool, for example, they also bring in additions, books that are relevant to, you know, their culture. So we try to incorporate all of this so that way we validate not only their culture, but the other cultures that we have in our school.
That's important. That's important. What about in instruction? What kind of activities, what evidence can you share with us about strategies that teachers use to ensure equitable participation of students? Any ideas on that one? Or I'm making sure that both program languages are used in a coordinated way, that both languages get equal value, status, and importance.
I'll be brave. So for this one, the first thing that came to mind was the PD we've had as a district in the biliteracy framework. And if you're not familiar with the biliteracy framework, you need to be. But essentially, it values what the student brings in their reading, in their language, in terms of reading. Because oftentimes, I was a victim of that myself. I came here as a 7th grader, very academically strong, and then they put those Dick and Jane type of books in front of me. And that's not what we need to be doing. That's not what we do nowadays if you are training the biliteracy framework.
Thank you. That biliteracy framework is very important. How much do your students know in either language? You know, if we don't check it out, if we don't assess, if we don't see, then you don't really know how proficient they might be. Any others in instruction? Other thoughts? Okay, no? Well, let's go to family and community. What do your schools do to make it a welcoming school?
Family and community.
Welcoming schools, anybody? I know you must all do.
I know
There we
there
go.
are folks that are doing things. I
I
overheard
know.
you.
Simple things like making sure that all of the signage in the building are in both languages, that you have people that speak all of the languages of your families at the front door, in the main office, things that you send home, making sure those things are in all of the languages that the families speak. You know, report cards, calendars, notices, and giving those both languages or the languages that are present at your school equal status when you are sending things home.
That's good. That's very good. Over here, Lisa. Last one.
In our district, we just started a campaign called Love Our Languages. So if you guys search the hashtag Love Our Languages, we are asking every adult, no matter what their role is in our school, so they could be teaching, or teachers, they can be associates, they can be our speech pathologists, because all of us serve students. Maybe it's one-on-one, maybe it's in small group, or maybe it's our entire class. But we ask teachers to have conversations about the languages that are present in our learning spaces, and we collect an entire list and we record it on a document. And even if students say, you know, I don't speak Polish, but my grandfather does, that counts. That's part of our linguistic identities. And so we post it on the outside of our door so that anyone who visits our building can see how proud we are of all of the linguistic assets that our students have.
That's wonderful. That's reinforcing the intergenerational and the family component of that kind of language experience. Well, thank you all for sharing your work that you do in your classrooms and in your schools. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who will start to ask a question is there a need for a fourth pillar?
Okay. So thanks so much, Beatrice. And I want to say, you know who Jose Medina's biggest mentor has been? It's Beatrice Arias, and he'll say that himself, okay? So I can't pretend to have nearly the length of experience as Beatrice has, but I'm hoping in my own way that I can contribute. I work at Cal, and I do support dual language. I've done so all my professional career. I was the director of the Office of Bilingual Education in Washington, D.C. public schools at a time that we only had one bilingual school, one dual language school, the Oyster International model, right? And the Oyster model was it was a two-way program where you had very affluent children from a certain demographic, the English speakers, and then you had students who really came from another neighborhood who were less affluent and who were Spanish speakers. And because that program in the early years, I'm not saying now because they've been working on it, but in the early years, because they didn't focus on the third pillar of sociocultural competence, you had students who were coming out who were of the privileged majority feeling more privileged after their experience at Oyster, and the students who were coming from the minoritized language feeling less well about themselves after those 5 years at Oyster, because they weren't looking at the sociocultural component, they were only looking at academics, and they were looking at the bilingual and biliteracy pillars. So it was my job as the director of the Office of Bilingual Education to begin other programs in which we created a number. It were the seeds and the saplings that grew. And what were they? One way one-way developmental programs for our many Latino students in our schools. And they were so successful because the people of communities ran them themselves. And what is happening now, and why do I feel so passionate about this now, is because there's such a thing as gentrification of a city. And there's also gentrification of a dual language program. And what we have now is folks who are more privileged coming into these schools, and it's only a few, because I worked as an AP in one of them not long ago, a very small minority, and they came in to an otherwise thriving, purely ethnic Hispanic school and turned the tide so that they were the ones with the political power in the school. So for me, we need to become more aggressive about cultural competency, and it's why we're talking about a fourth pillar. How do we strengthen the cultural competency piece by perhaps adding a fourth pillar in which we are looking at socio-critical consciousness, socio-political consciousness, critical consciousness. So what I did was to go through the 7 strands and say, well, if we created an explicit fourth pillar, what would we add? Just some of the examples of what we would add to each of those strands that would represent being a little bit more aggressive about this, okay? So that's what I did. And I look at, you know, our leader in this, right? The leader of of critical consciousness in education, and that is Paulo Freire. And what did he say? Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. This is what we want to do, right? This is where we want to move to with a fourth pillar. And I look at where I got my education around what is multicultural education. I got it from who I consider in the States the father of multicultural education, James A. Banks. And what did he say? Unity without diversity leads to, I can't even read it from here. Oh, here, I can read it here. Unity without diversity leads to hegemony, and diversity without unity leads to chaos. How brilliant, right? How brilliant. Okay, so he looked at how we can look at multicultural education. It's also kind of an older term, right? But we know what we're talking about here, right? We could look at it from 4 approaches. We could look at it from the contributions. Well, what's the contributions? That's Heroes and Holidays. You know, that's pictures of Black and Latino, Latina, Latinx scientists hung in the school hallway bulletin boards. Okay? That's American Indians depicted in headdress and moccasins, okay? And celebrating and not realizing who Native Americans are today. That's not what they do today, right? So, the ethnic additive, okay, that's getting a little bit better than just the contributions model. But it still isn't where we need to be. What is that? Well, it's starting to look at multicultural perspectives in the curriculum, but it's still from the viewpoint of the status quo people in power. So if you're looking at the American Revolution, you've got the Betsy Ross syndrome of looking at women, right? Or you have the Crispus Attucks syndrome, which is looking at African Americans in the American Revolution. And all of this is that mainstream perspective of events, and all it's doing is perpetuating the status quo. So what is the transformative? This transformative is where we need to go, right? Because it's the Hamilton phenomenon. In the American Revolution, let's look at the founding of the US from the perspective of other than white Anglo-Saxon men who owned land. It's more than that, right? We have different perspectives, and we're not saying we're going to dismiss that perspective entirely, no. But let's look at that as one perspective. And there are other perspectives to our history, which would include the Native Americans at the time, the women at the time, the African Americans, the newly arrived immigrants who didn't own land, who came to these shores. And let's have our students learn about those perspectives, right? And then the culminating approach is the decision-making and social action. So what we're doing is we're having students think about taking action based on study and analysis and knowledge and values, so that when they begin to see discrimination, they want to do something about it themselves. They want to do something themselves about discrimination that they see in the schools or in the society at large, right? And they themselves would be demanding a transformative curriculum for themselves, right? This is moving beyond I think, the socio-cultural as it appears currently in the Guiding Principles book. So if we look at pillar by pillar, how would this look in program structure? Well, we could say, or can add, well, the program prohibits discriminatory practices. So there are assurances that minoritized language students are not enrolled in the program primarily as language models for the English home language speakers when you're developing those two-way programs. And they're not bused into otherwise English-speaking neighborhoods, which I have had first account. We do evaluations in Cal, and I have seen this happen, okay? More than once. We have to look at then the language allocation plan, that it favors the learning needs of every group and doesn't favor the learning needs of one group over another. In program structure, we also need to look at the program's vision and mission being inclusive of the minoritized language groups' dreams and aspirations. So it's assurances that the planning committees include voices of all community members, and that this decision-making entities in the school include representation from all language groups in a substantive and meaningful way, not tokenism. We also need to look at the program prohibiting these discriminatory practices. No, I had already said that. Okay, what happened here? All right. Okay, how about the curriculum? So that the curriculum goes beyond contributions and ethnic attitude approaches and purposefully and systematically addresses transformation and social action. So the curriculum includes multi-ethnic perspectives, depth of knowledge on issues of socio-political consequence, and invites students to engage in products that lead to, in Paulo Freire's words, participation in the transformation of the world. In instruction, we're looking at instructional practices that are implemented to ensure that all students learn and have access to high-level concepts and cerebral engagement. So teachers don't expect more from some of the students and less from other students, and that diverse opinions, even those that challenge the status quo, are embraced and valued. Also in instruction, all language varieties are valid. Non-standard varieties of the program languages are acknowledged and respected, and teachers affirm translanguaging practices to honor and respect the language variety identities of the students and their families. How about in assessment and accountability? Well, assessment is conducted in both program language and it's interpreted fairly. And accountability encompasses both program languages. So what is taught in a language is assessed in that language. And assessments are authentic to each language and are not translations at the same time. Accountability takes in from biliteracy squared that bilingual trajectory. The kids are not going to be moving at the same place in literacy. They're going to be doing a little bit better in the language in which they come in more orally proficient, more stronger in, right? And so expectations that they're at the same place from the beginning is not realistic, but you want to look at those side by side, and with quality instruction, they will become equal. And how about state English, okay, are already, but state Spanish language arts, math, and science assessments are developed and recognized for accountability purposes. We need that. We need that. We all should be raising a ruckus about that in our states to make it to the federal level. Okay, as far as staff quality and professional development, prospective staff are screened for cultural competency. We make sure that they come in with cultural competency. And there's ongoing professional development, which includes attention to what is considered here the fourth pillar. So hiring practices include screening for language and cultural biases. We don't want you in the program if you don't honor the kids and their families and really know that they can learn and they will be supported in this school. Staff professional development includes training in developing and delivering lessons reflective of the transformative and social action approach. And cultural proficiency is an ongoing professional development topic, because are there any of us in this room who are fully culturally proficient? No, none of us are. We've been conditioned too much in our lives. What is the important thing is when we're thinking something that's not culturally proficient, we catch ourselves. We catch ourselves, right? And lastly, of the pillars, then we're going to ask you to respond to this too in another table talk. That prospective school community, we're sort of coming full circle to what we talked about in the program structure, but the prospective school community engages in introspection about the whys of dual language program, especially with the many programs, the two-way programs that are starting up now, right? Because it's all the fad to do dual language now. So during planning for new programs, partners from all language backgrounds are involved in deciding the mission and the vision of the program, as well as all other aspects of the program. And all the families are not only encouraged, but they must think of goals beyond global employment opportunities for their children. This is more than that. This is a commitment that goes way beyond that if they are going to be in two-way programs, right? Okay. So you can tell I feel strongly about this, I imagine. So we wanted you to turn it to you and to see if you think there is value. You know, we want to know, do you think that the socio-cultural is already captured in the Guiding Principles book already? And so many of you are familiar with it, you raised your hand. Or do you believe that Cal and the folks that we work with, Dual Language of New Mexico, and others, do you think that we should be creating a fourth pillar that takes a more aggressive stance on and move to a critical consciousness beyond socio-cultural? Is that the next? Should that be the next activity or stance or belief system along that continuum that Beatrice was talking about? And why or why not? Okay, so please talk at your tables.
So you'll identify the people. Well, we only have about 10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes left.
So we have 8.
Okay, so you know it's getting to be that time, and I'm standing between you and your margaritas, so I don't want to do that. All right, but can we just hear from a couple of people about this? I mean, I think it would be great to have a longer discussion about this at another time. And Beatrice and I think, are going to be writing some more briefs about this for Cal. But does anyone want to say something about whether they think a fourth pillar should be added?
More of a comment and a question, maybe, because I think as in a dual language school, sometimes we already struggle with the idea of having, you know, the materials and the testing in both languages, and is it, you know, would it open a whole, I don't know, like would there be people that are making, you know, those decisions and those things that will actually get us there quickly, soon? Like, we need it now, and I think
you mean pick your battles? In a way, like pick your battles, what do we need to have first?
Kind of, and
because I think if we don't start doing these things, we're never going to get what we need. Never.
Mm-hmm. All right.
You know what I mean? I mean, I think so. If somebody else has another viewpoint, be glad to hear it.
So I do believe that critical consciousness should be added because kind of adding on to her worry and your response, it lays that foundation, the social justice that needs to be there, the equity that needs to be there. I think that gives the power and the legitimacy to really focus on that, and it names it explicitly in a way that I think it can help our programs grow in the way they were meant to grow and decenter the whiteness, the middle class that can leverage and can benefit from this, and really shift it to have them be the advocates for empowering our marginalized communities in the program.
I mean, look what Guiding Principles has already done. It's a document you can bring out. You can say, this is Dual Language of New Mexico. This is the Center for Applied Linguistics. So in the face of people who don't want to do it, you have evidence. This is what should be done. So if you add the fourth pillar, it's evidence of what should be done, right? Okay.
So I think you should definitely pursue this fourth pillar. I mean, what you said about stopping the gentrification of dual language programs really resonated. I've been in 2 different states, worked in 4 different dual language schools, and now I'm an administrator, and I can tell you that I have dealt with multiple occasions of having to confront whiteness and privilege and having to make people understand, like, this program, you are gaining so much from this program, but the reality is we're also trying to uplift our communities at the same time. And you're welcome in this space, and you're welcome to be with our families and our communities and learn together. But you are not the decision makers in this space.
And what is that doing? Because that's going to be the next step. I mean, we can say these things, then how do we do it, right? Because I think on one hand, we have to have the families gain power and learn how to take power. And we have to have the privilege understand that privilege. And, you know, that's not an easy thing. But if we don't start and we aren't all in this together, then it'll never happen.
Ooh, that's loud.
Okay, one more.
Well, I'm going to include these 2, even though they may not want to.
Please,
we were
yes.
thinking that not as a final step, but rather as I called it lens, she called it over, you know, like the umbrella. So leave it the way it is, because what I'm afraid of is if it's put as a fourth pillar, then people can go around saying, well, yeah, we follow that, but only the 3. You know, we haven't gotten to the fourth.
Oh, wow. Put it as a whole umbrella.
So it's on
Oh,
top.
I like that idea.
So
because it really impacts everything, and it
does.
Yeah, right. Because even as it is, the cultural competence is embedded in the guiding principles. In each one, let's put it as an umbrella. That's how important it is. I like that. Everybody who likes that one? The umbrella. Woo, we got it. Is there one more, or it's 4? Okay. And as we're going to have another comment, but I just want a housekeeping detail too, is that if you we'll send you the handout of the presentation. If you just give us your name, organization, and your email address, either on the green card or the Cal News card, we'll send you the handout. And leave it on your table. Just leave it on your table. But we want to hear this woman. Don't get up yet. We want to hear what our fellow educator has to say.
Just right quick, and I want to build on what she said, but I am thinking instead of an umbrella, foundation would be better. Like
Oh, a
the
foundation. Yeah, how should we put that? Oh, we've got a lot of clicks for that one. Yes. All right. Okay, anything else for the good of the whole?
Lisa, it has to be a non-negotiable. If you don't have this consciousness, then you're not doing the right for these children. So when we were having that discussion during lunch, I'm like thinking about it. I'm like, it has to be more than a pillar. It has to be a non-negotiable.
More than either a foundation or umbrella, but more than the pillar. Yeah, okay, I heard everybody. That seems to be the consensus. So here we're coming up for air. after we took that deep dive. And we hope that we hear from you, and you will hear from us, possibly. We will. If you fill this out, we're going to send you the handout. So thanks, everybody, for being here today.